Bernie Sanders, Joe Biden, Michael Bloomberg, Elizabeth Warren, Pete Buttigieg, and Amy Klobuchar faced off in Las Vegas, Nevada for the 9th Democratic debate of the 2020 election. The event, hosted by NBC News, MSNBC, and the Nevada Independent, was the last chance for the Democratic presidential candidates to square off before the critical Nevada Caucuses. It was also probably the most entertaining debate of the Democratic primary race so far. Klobuchar and Buttigieg barely bothered to disguise their obvious disdain for one another. Warren made scattershot attacks against multiple candidates at the same time, and Biden was awake the whole time. The frontrunner of the race, Bernie Sanders, fended off attacks from just about every candidate on stage. That is, when moderators gave him a chance to do so. And the newcomer to the stage, Michael Bloomberg, was dunked on over and over again from literally everyone else in attendance, including a couple of the moderators.
Several former employees have claimed that your company was a hostile workplace for women.
Quote, we put all the cops in the minority neighborhoods, and you explain that as, quote, because that's where all the crime is.
When you were confronted about it, you admitted making sexually suggestive remarks, saying, quote, that's the way I grew up.
You went on to say, and the way you should get the guns out of the kids' hands is to throw them against the wall and frisk them.
In a lawsuit in the 1990s, according to the Washington Post, one former female employee alleged that you said, quote, I would do you in a second.
What does that kind of language say about how you view people of color or people in minority neighborhoods?
In this video, I'm going to talk about the winners and losers of the Nevada Democratic debate. I'm actually going to rank all of the candidates from best to worst performance, so I won't just tell you who won and who lost in my opinion. I'll also answer the questions, who was the biggest loser, and who was the biggest winner.
I think we have two questions to face tonight. One is, who can beat Donald Trump? And number two, who can do the job if they get into the White House? And I would argue that I am the candidate that can do exactly both of those things.
Let's start with the biggest loser of the night, Michael Bloomberg. As I mentioned in my intro, Bloomberg was dunked on by literally every other candidate on stage and a couple of moderators. I actually put up a compilation of all the Bloomberg attacks for my patrons, and the video is over 10 minutes long. Here are some of the highlights. Bloomberg was harangued for his past support of stop and frisk, and for multiple court cases involving his company creating a hostile work environment for women.
I'd like to talk about who we're running against. A billionaire who calls women fat broads and horse-faced lesbians. And no, I'm not talking about Donald Trump. I'm talking about Mayor Bloomberg.
In order to beat Donald Trump, we're going to need the largest voter turnout in the history of the United States. Mr. Bloomberg had policies in New York City of stop and frisk, which went after African American and Latino people in an outrageous way. That is not a way you're going to grow voter turnout.
And I hope you heard what his defense was. I've been nice to some women.
He had stop and frisk, throwing close to 5 million young black men up against the wall. And when we came along in our administration, President Obama, and said we're going to send in a mediator to stop it, he said that's unnecessary.
Democrats are not going to win if we have a nominee who has a history of hiding his tax returns, of harassing women, and of supporting racist policies like redlining and stop and frisk.
Even his apology for stop and frisk was put under the magnifying glass and called out for its failure to address the ill intentions of the policy.
The language he used is about stop and frisk. It's about how it turned out. Now, this isn't about how it turned out. This is about what it was designed to do to begin with. It targeted black and brown men from the beginning.
When it came to the issue of his company mistreating women, Bloomberg was asked to release the women from their non-disclosure agreements, and he refused to do so.
So, Mr. Mayor, are you willing to release all of those women from those non-disclosure agreements so we can hear their side of the story? And if they wish now to speak out and tell their side of the story about what it is they allege, that's now okay with you? You're releasing them on television tonight?
Senator? No.
Is that right?
They decided when they made an agreement that they wanted to keep it quiet for everybody's interest. They signed the agreements, and that's what we're going to live with.
I'm sorry.
All the mayor has to do is say, you are released from the non-disclosure agreement. Period.
Bloomberg was also criticized for supporting George Bush and Republican senators, and for opposing Barack Obama.
But maybe we should also ask how Mayor Bloomberg in 2004 supported George W. Bush for president, put money into Republican candidates for the United States Senate when some of us, Joe and I and others, were fighting for Democrats to control the United States Senate.
And
maybe we can talk about a billionaire saying that we should not raise the minimum wage, or that we should cut Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. If that's a way to beat Donald Trump, wow, I would be very surprised.
Thank you.
Our party has a tradition that includes excellent presidents like Barack Obama, who Mayor Bloomberg opposed. At the end of the day, it's not just about how much money you've got. It's what you stand for.
He was called out for arguing against raising the minimum wage and supporting cuts to Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. He was called out for hiding behind his TV ads and telling other major candidates to drop out of the race.
I have been told as a woman, as someone that maybe no one thought was still going to be standing up on this stage, I've been told many times to wait my turn and to step aside. And I'm not going to do that because a campaign memo from Mayor Bloomberg said this morning that the only way that we get a nominee is if we step aside for him.
A more talented speaker might have been able to fend off some of these attacks, but as I pointed out in my debate predictions video, Bloomberg is not good at debating. Aside from his inexperience on the presidential debate stage and general lack of charisma, what really made the attacks on Bloomberg land was the fact that he kind of came off as a caricature of a villainous rich guy. He bragged about his wealth, he was curt to the moderators and other candidates, he made light of his own inappropriate comments to women, he equated programs to empower workers with communism.
Fortunately, I make a lot of money, and we do business all around the world, and we are preparing it. The number of pages will probably be in the thousands of pages. I can't go to TurboTax.
Should you have earned that much money?
Yes. I worked very hard for it. Well, you can join me at MikeBloomberg.com, too, if you want, but I'm not asking for any money. Let me say a couple things, and if I can have my full minute and a quarter, thank you. The facts are, I was there. Let me finish, thank you. We have a very few non-disclosure agreements.
How many is
Let me
that?
finish. None of them accuse me of doing anything other than maybe they didn't like the joke I told. And let me put.
They feel like cogs in a machine. I want workers to be able to sit on corporate boards as well, so they can have some say over what happens to their lives.
We're not going to throw out capitalism. We tried that. Other countries tried that. It was called communism, and it just didn't work.
The only thing Bloomberg got right was focusing his attacks on Bernie Sanders. Unfortunately for Bloomberg, he seemed totally unprepared to do so. He used rather dated smears, and none of them seemed to land.
The best-known socialist in the country happens to be a millionaire with 3 houses. What'd I miss here? I don't think there's any chance of the senator beating President Trump. You don't start out by saying, I've got 160 million people. I'm going to take away the insurance plan that they love.
Where in the last 3 years, billionaires in this country saw an $850 billion increase in their wealth. Congratulations, Mr. Bloomberg. But the average American last year saw less than a 1% increase in his or her income. That's wrong.
Mayor Bloomberg.
Billionaires today, if you can believe it, have an effective tax rate lower than the middle class.
Senator,
So maybe
you're
just
the tax code. Why are you complaining?
What?
You wrote the code. You
did. You and your campaign.
99
you and your not me. You and your campaign contributions electing people who represent the wealthy and the powerful.
Yes,
those are the folks.
Democrats. Thank you.
Well, and Republicans too.
Okay.
You know what, Mr. Bloomberg? It wasn't you who made all that money. Maybe your workers played some role in that as well.
Amy Klobuchar was, I think, the second worst debater of the night. Klobuchar seemed to pull out just about every tired platitude she's ever employed in past debates, which really isn't a good look.
You don't put your money on a number that's not even on the wheel. And the truth is that when you see some troubled waters, you don't blow up a bridge, you build one. We need a candidate that can bring people with her. What unites us is so much bigger than what divides us.
She also had plenty of new mom jokes to make.
I was thinking there's going to be a boxing rematch on Saturday in Vegas, and those guys should go down there. And I've done that every single time. I have won every race down to 4th grade. A lot of boasting up here, so thought I'd add that. I must say I take personal offense since Post-it notes were invented in my state. Yeah, I'm just looking at my husband in the front row that has to do our taxes all the time. We probably could go to TurboTax. I had a physical, by the way. It came out well. We might all be surprised if my blood pressure is lower than Mayor Pete's. That might really shock everyone out there.
She also made a bold suggestion about how to solve misogyny on the internet.
I have an idea of how we can stop sexism on the internet. We could nominate a woman.
Amy, we did that in 2016. I don't think it worked. On a more serious note, Klobuchar was called out on the 2 big news stories involving her and her record. Moderators asked her about not prosecuting police officers and for prosecuting a black teenager with scant evidence.
When you were the top prosecutor in Minneapolis, Senator, there were at least 24 instances where police were involved in the deaths of civilians. None of those officers were prosecuted. You did prosecute a black teenager who was sentenced to life in prison, despite what are now serious doubts about the evidence. Now, the Minneapolis chapter of the NAACP has recently called for you to suspend your campaign over that case because some new evidence has come out since. Big picture, why should black and Latino voters trust your judgment now if it appears you may have gotten it wrong then?
She had a clearly prepared response to these issues, and it wasn't terrible, but I think she still took damage nonetheless. Klobuchar was also called out for not being able to name the president of Mexico. While Warren jumped to her defense on the matter, this is still a fairly embarrassing moment to be rehashing, and reminds one of moments that sunk candidates in past elections, like Rick Perry's oops moment or Herman Cain's Libya flub. Klobuchar also had multiple clashes with Buttigieg that didn't do her any favors. She called him out using a point about electability in a statewide contest.
I am the one, not you, that has won statewide in congressional district after congressional district. And I will say, when you tried in Indiana, Pete, to run, what happened to you? You lost by over 20 points.
She had used that same argument in a past debate to great effect, but it just doesn't work as well now. The fact of the matter is, he's now run in Iowa and New Hampshire and secured the most delegates so far. Pete called her out for voting to make English the national language, for voting for Trump's judges, and for voting to confirm Trump's head of Customs and Border Protection. In response, Klobuchar called Pete out for not being in the arena facing these tough points, and the disdain was clear with a reference to him memorizing talking points.
You have not been in the arena doing that work. You've memorized a bunch of talking points and a bunch of things, but I can tell you one thing. What the people of this country want, they want a leader that has the heart for the immigrants of this country, and that is me.
Overall, these clashes were not totally one-sided, they cut both ways. The constant bickering of Amy and Pete throughout this debate, I think, weakened both candidates, especially when we saw them talk over each other and not cease squabbling as moderators tried to move on.
We're going to talk about votes in the Senate in Washington. Let's talk about it.
Let's talk about a major policy.
Next question. Hello. Thank you. Senator Warren and Mayor Bloomberg, this question is for you. I want to talk about, and maybe this is appropriate here.
Can I just defend Senator Klobuchar for a minute?
Pete also looked pretty petty going after Klobuchar so aggressively when he's generally outperforming her by significant margins.
You're literally in part of the committee that's overseeing these things, and we're not able to speak to literally the first thing about the politics of the country to ourselves.
Are you trying to say that I'm dumb, or are you mocking me here, Pete?
The tiff really brought Buttigieg down to her level, and it's one of the reasons he had a mixed performance, placing him in my rankings in 4th. Don't get me wrong, Pete did a lot right in this debate. He had a great line about climate change.
Let's be real about the deadline. It's not 2050, it's not 2040, it's not 2030, it's 2020. Because if we don't elect a president who actually believes in climate science now, we will never meet any of the other scientific or policy deadlines that we need to.
He also wisely demonstrated his Spanish language skills.
That they were as American as we are. A los sonidores hay que decir que este país es tu país también.
Sure, it's pandering, but probably not a bad idea in advance of a caucus in a state with a high number of Latino voters, especially since the only other strong Spanish speaker, Julian Castro, is out of the race. Buttigieg was also wise in choosing his targets for attacks, other than Klobuchar. He hit Mayor Bloomberg, who is both surging and low-hanging fruit, and the front-runner of the race, Bernie Sanders. Some of Pete's attacks on Sanders were stronger than others. Arguing that Sanders hasn't fully accounted for how to fund his Medicare for all is a fair point and completely true, even if Pete used somewhat misleading numbers to exaggerate the problem.
Matter of fact, if you add up his policies all together, they come to $50 trillion. He's only explained $25 trillion worth of revenue, which means that the hole in there is bigger than the size of the entire economy of the United States.
Pete was also clever to try to position himself as the middle ground candidate between Bloomberg and Sanders, both of whom are polarizing candidates. Pete missed the mark, though, in characterizing Sanders as a socialist who thinks capitalism is the root of all evil, and a candidate who wants to burn this party down. Those attacks were a little too hyperbolic. Sanders, of course, has never said either of those things, and his rebuttal to these descriptions was pretty powerful.
If speaking to the needs and the pain of a long-neglected working class is polarizing, I think you got the wrong word. What we are trying finally to do is to give a voice to people who, after 45 years of work, are not making a nickel more than they did 45 years ago. We are giving a voice to people who are saying we are sick and tired of billionaires like Mr. Bloomberg seeing huge expansions of their wealth while 500,000 people sleep out on the street tonight. And that's so what we are saying, Pete, is maybe it's a time for the working class of this country to have a little bit of power in Washington rather than your billionaire campaign contributors.
All right, look, first of all,
I know.
Another problem for Pete's attacks against Sanders was the fact that moderator Chuck Todd brought up his past admiration of the senator.
You know, in 2000, you wrote an award-winning essay. You praised Senator Sanders. You specifically praised him for embracing socialism. You have now since said that you're concerned about his policies.
Pete tried to brush this problem aside, but kind of put his foot in his mouth at another point in the debate, when he brought up that as far as pursuing the American dream goes, the top country in the world to do it in is Denmark.
The list of countries to live out the American dream, in other words, to be born at the bottom and come out at the top, we're not even in the top 10. Number one place to live out the American dream right now is Denmark. And as the...
Sanders smiled and chuckled when he made this point, since it highlights exactly why Bernie might be right on the issues. He imports most of his policy proposals from Scandinavian countries like Denmark and Sweden. Generally speaking, Pete's mixed showing could be seen as a win or a loss, depending on context. I don't think his performance will have a significant impact on his standing in the polls, considering that his standing nationwide and in the next couple of states is nowhere near where it needs to be in order to secure a victory in the primary race. I chalk up his debate performance as a mild loss. With an edge in his conflicts with Buttigieg, Bernie Sanders secures a third-place finish for the Nevada debate. Sanders was struck with a number of tough questions and attacks from other candidates. Unlike Bloomberg, however, he handled them generally well. Responding to a question from Chuck Todd about the jobs that would be lost if his ban on fracking went forward, Sanders not only pointed out the seriousness of climate change, he also explained how the Green New Deal he supports would create new jobs itself.
Joe said it right. This is an existential threat. You know what that means, Chuck? That means we're fighting for the future of this planet. And the Green New Deal that I support, by the way, will create up to 20 million good-paying jobs as we move our energy system away from fossil fuel to energy efficiency and sustainable energy.
Lester Holt asked Sanders about a poll in which the majority of voters said they were uncomfortable with a socialist president.
Latest NBC News Wall Street Journal poll released yesterday, 2/3 of all voters said they were uncomfortable with a socialist candidate for president.
Sanders responded first by pointing out that he actually won that poll by strong margins.
What was the result of that poll? Who was winning? But I was winning, and I think by a fairly comfortable margin. Mike mentioned that.
Before explaining the difference between socialism and his own democratic socialist stance.
Let's talk about democratic socialism, not communism, Mr. Bloomberg. That's a cheap shot. Let's talk about what goes on in countries like Denmark, where Pete correctly pointed out they have a much higher quality of life in many respects than we do. What are we talking about?
Another question by Chuck Todd also helped Sanders. The moderator asked every candidate on stage whether they agree that the candidate who gets the most pledged delegates should win the nomination, even if the convention goes to a second ballot. In other words, should the superdelegates support whoever the Democratic voters choose, or is it okay for them to ignore the will of the people? Literally every candidate on stage sided against democracy, except for Bernie Sanders.
So you want the convention to work its will?
Yes.
People have the delegates that are pledged to them, and they keep those delegates until you come to the convention. All of the people.
Or not?
No, let the process work its way out.
Not necessarily, not till there's a
Senator
majority.
Klobuchar?
Let the process work.
Well, the process includes 500 superdelegates on the second ballot. So I think that the will of the people should prevail. Yes.
Thank you, guys.
The most votes should become the nominee.
5 no's and a yes.
Sanders was also quite effective in his attacks against a rising challenger in the race, Michael Bloomberg. He was the first to bring up Bloomberg's record on stop and frisk, and the only candidate to point out the former Republican had supported George W. Bush. Sanders had plenty of strong arguments for Medicare for All as well, pointing out that every other major country on earth is able to have a similar program, and as a result, get better healthcare for less. He also emphasized how universal coverage has been a policy pursued as far back as Teddy Roosevelt's day. At the same time, Sanders was dogged repeatedly on how he would pay for Medicare for All. The criticism that he hasn't fully worked out how to pay for the entire program is a reasonable criticism that I think has some resonance. Sanders explained that he'd cover the remainder with progressive taxes, including his wealth tax, but a precise plan hasn't been laid out. That's in part because the exact cost of Medicare for All remains largely unknown, but that too is a potential point of weakness for Sanders. Even with arguments about how every other country has managed to do the same thing, moderates were able to score some points by fear-mongering about the sheer scale of the change. Sanders was also attacked by multiple candidates, including Buttigieg and Warren, on the apparent nastiness of his supporters online, a theme harped upon by a recent ad by Michael Bloomberg. While I find this attack to be ridiculous, Sanders has often and in clear language called upon his supporters to be civil. There is some sense in which I think older moderate voters might have reservations about Sanders in light of this narrative. It, in my view, shamefully depicts Sanders' supporters as especially vicious, which is an attack not on a candidate but on ordinary American people. But I'm not sure that Sanders escaped these attacks totally unscathed. There were a few times where Sanders was attacked by another candidate, and he either didn't get a chance to respond to the attack, or the rhythm of the debate structure made his defense less effective. It's hard to respond effectively to an attack if you can't respond right away, and there were times where the audience sat with an attack against Sanders for quite some time before he got a chance to speak. All in all, Sanders had an effective debate performance. It wasn't flawless, but it's not likely to diminish his overall standing in the polls. And when you're the frontrunner, that's certainly good enough to be called a win. Quite to my surprise, I think an even stronger performance came from Joe Biden. Joe Biden has been recurrently ineffective in most debates, so I honestly might be grading on a curve at this point. But the former VP really turned it on for the Nevada debate. Biden was energized and aggressive without being too mean. He also, right at the top of the debate, effectively positioned himself as the most electable candidate in the field.
In terms of who can beat Donald Trump, NBC did a poll yesterday. It says Joe Biden is best equipped to beat Donald Trump. That's what your poll said.
While Biden rehashed some tired arguments about Medicare for All's costs, which I think anyone following these debates are sick of hearing by now, but he did hit Bernie on an issue which is actually quite a weakness.
This is the industry we should be able to sue. We should go after, just like we did the drug companies. The only company we can't go after are gun manufacturers. Because my buddy here, but that's a different issue.
Biden's relentless attacks on Michael Bloomberg were astounding. The only conflict that seemed to get Biden into trouble was with Elizabeth Warren. after the latter accused him of being in the pocket of Mitch McConnell.
It was said that I was in the pocket of Mitch McConnell. I'm the only person on this stage that's beaten Mitch McConnell on 4 major cases. Let me finish. I don't need to be told I'm a friend of Mitch McConnell's. Mitch McConnell has been the biggest pain in my neck in a long time.
Here's what happened. According to the New York Times, the last time that Mitch McConnell was on the ballot, the vice president stood in the Oval Office and said, "I hope that Mitch gets reelected so I can keep working with him." When Mitch did get reelected, he did not have an epiphany. Instead, he blocked nearly everything that Barack Obama tried to pass.
Did you ever
and
win
he stole a Supreme Court seat from the Democrats, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Senator.
This was really the lowest point for Biden in this debate. Dismissing Warren's accomplishments was the only time he crossed the line over to looking nasty. Her bringing up the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau was pretty much a checkmate. It looked like he might have wanted to rehash his old argument that he had worked to get that passed behind the scenes, but the last time he tried to take credit for her accomplishments, it didn't work out so well. So instead, he left her point on the table, completely unchallenged. Probably wise to cut his losses there, but it was a definitive win for Warren. It was also by no means her only strong moment in this debate. I do believe that Elizabeth Warren was the clearest winner of the Nevada debate. After a poor performance in the New Hampshire debate, she really needed a comeback, and her supporters were no doubt delighted by what she had on offer. Her first line in the debate was probably the most memorable line in the entire event.
A billionaire who calls women fat broads and horse-faced lesbians. And no, I'm not talking about Donald Trump. I'm talking about Mayor Bloomberg.
In a more extended bout with the mayor, she continuously hammered away at his wishy-washy claims about non-disclosure agreements. By getting him to directly refuse to release the women from those contracts, Warren made it pretty clear that Bloomberg had skeletons hiding in his closet. That had to cause serious damage to his campaign, while at the same time bolstering her as a warrior for women.
The mayor has to stand on his record, and what we need to know is exactly what's lurking out there. He has gotten some number of women, dozens, who knows, to sign non-disclosure agreements, both for sexual harassment and for gender discrimination in the workplace. So, Mr. Mayor, are you willing to release all of those women from those non-disclosure agreements? You're releasing them on television tonight?
Senator? No.
Is that right?
Asked to challenge Sanders on the issue of his mean supporters, Warren was able to continue the bleeding for Sanders on the issue without getting too down in the dirt.
Are Senator Sanders and his supporters making it harder for Democrats to unify in November?
Look, I have said many times before, we are all responsible for our supporters, and we need to step up. That's what leadership is all about. But the way we are going to lead this country and beat Donald Trump is going to be with a candidate who has rock-solid values and who actually gets something done.
By simply saying that the candidates are responsible for their supporters and then moving on, she kind of attacked Sanders in such a way that a pushback from him would seem a little petty. Indeed, he's continued his policy of not launching attacks against Elizabeth Warren on the debate stage or in interviews, despite the fact that she's nipped at him a number of times in recent weeks. In this debate, she went after him multiple times. For the most part, Warren's attacks on Sanders were issued in combination with attacks on moderate candidates, Biden and Buttigieg. Here's an example.
Democrats want to beat Donald Trump, but they are worried. They are worried about gambling on a narrow vision that doesn't address the fears of millions of Americans across this country who see real problems and want real change. They are worried about gambling on a revolution that won't bring along a majority of this country. Amy and Joe's hearts are in the right place, but we can't be so eager to be liked by Mitch McConnell that we forget how to fight the Republicans. Mayor Buttigieg has been taking money from big donors and changing his positions. So it makes it unclear what it is he stands for other than his
Senator,
own.
thank you. Senator Klobuchar, go ahead.
These scattershot attacks on multiple candidates at the same time should probably be studied by politicians for years to come. They're actually a brilliant debate strategy. When you attack one candidate, they get to respond right away, and often either nullify your attack or counterattack you. But when you attack several candidates at the same time, they each get a turn one by one to respond, which makes their parry far less effective. At several points, the debate went to commercial break before a candidate was able to defend themselves against an attack from Elizabeth Warren. This scattershot technique might seem somewhat underhanded if we look at a debate through an idealistic lens, that it's an opportunity for wisdom to be revealed through an adversarial presentation of information. But if you look at presidential debates for what I think they are, a marketing opportunity for a politician where the goal is to improve your brand while dirtying up the competition, with that more cynical perspective in mind, Warren's shown herself to be a somewhat brilliant tactician. Dominating the stage, Elizabeth Warren was probably the #1 winner of the Nevada debate. At the same time, even this extremely strong performance might be too little too late to save her campaign for the Democratic nomination. While I think Warren had the best night of all the candidates, the primary election seems to have narrowed in on Bernie Sanders and a shrinking group of moderate competitors. Sanders has already proved himself to be the candidate to beat in this race. With that broader context in mind, his generally positive performance seems sufficient to make him an even better answer to this question: who was the biggest winner?